Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into something that sounds a bit like a Hollywood thriller, but is actually playing out right inside your medicine cabinet. We're talking about medicine security. You know, when you're sick, you grab a pill bottle and take your medication, completely trusting that it is exactly what the label says it is. But ensuring that reality, well, it's a massive, multi-billion-dollar global challenge. In fact, the World Health Organization estimates that in some parts of the world, literally 1 in 10 medical products are substandard or just outright falsified. So today in this explainer, we're going to unpack exactly how the world's biggest pharmaceutical companies prove to the public and to their investors that they are actively protecting their products from being faked, stolen, or compromised. To figure out how they do this, we're going straight to the rulebook, the SSAB standards, which are now part of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB. Now, these aren't just gentle, polite suggestions for companies to follow. These are rigorous, standardized metrics mandated for the biotechnology and pharmaceuticals industry. These documents force corporations to put hard, undeniable numbers to their security measures. We're looking specifically at the framework that dictates exactly how a company absolutely must report its efforts to lock down its supply chain. All right, so here is our game plan to map out this pharmaceutical security fortress today. We're going to cover 1. The threat of fakes, 2. Technologies of traceability, 3. Raids, seizures, and arrests, and finally, 4. Auditing the supply chain. Let's jump right in. Starting us off with part 1, the threat of fakes. So, what exactly is a counterfeit? You're probably picturing cheap, obvious knockoffs, sold in a back alley, right? Well, actually, scratch that. The SASB definition is way broader than you might think. It explicitly defines counterfeit products as drugs sold under a product name without proper authorization. This means the threat applies to incredibly expensive brand name medications and your everyday generic drugs alike. A counterfeit might look absolutely perfect on the outside, but inside, it might be totally missing the active pharmaceutical ingredient you need. Or even more dangerously, it might contain way too much of it, or literally the entirely wrong chemical. And sometimes it's just completely authentic drugs stuffed into fake, mislabeled packaging to bypass regional laws. And this is exactly why the big pharma companies and their investors care so deeply about this. Fake or substandard medication isn't just a terrifying health hazard, it's a massive financial and reputational landmine. If a company fails to stop counterfeit drugs from slipping into the distribution system, they're looking at a catastrophic loss of public confidence and deeply reduced revenue. Investors are hyper-focused on these metrics because a company that can't protect its own supply chain is basically a sitting duck for financial loss. The stakes literally couldn't be higher here. Which brings us to the alarms of our fortress in part 2, technologies of traceability. Think of this as tracing a day in the life of a pill. Traceability, according to the standards, is the ability to track identifying information across 4 very specific stages. It kicks off at stage 1 with raw material sourcing, like where exactly are the chemical components coming from. Then there's stage 2, the actual manufacturing. Stage 3 is the super complex web of distribution and wholesale. And finally, stage 4 brings us to pharmacy, retail, and transportation logistics. If you lose visibility of the product at literally any one of these handoffs, boom, you've just created a loophole for a counterfeit to slip right in. So how are they actually keeping their eyes on the product the whole time? Well, under metric HCBP 260A.1, companies are forced to disclose the exact tech they're using to prevent counterfeiting. And it's a heavily layered approach. They have to report on things like advanced barcode technology and radio frequency identification, or RFID tagging. That's what allows entire pallets of drugs to be scanned instantly. But it goes way deeper than just tracking the cardboard box. They also track the actual chemical composition and keep incredibly rigid processing history logs. Basically, they're creating a permanent digital footprint for every single batch of medicine. But hey, technology alone isn't going to save the day. You need a rock-solid communication protocol. Metric HCBP 260A.2 dictates that companies must disclose their exact processes for alerting their entire network the second a counterfeit risk is identified. They have to have a plan to warn customers, which means patients and physicians, as well as all their business partners like suppliers, wholesalers, and hospitals. And they also have to lay out their specific mechanisms for executing a rapid product recall to minimize any risk to human life. It's basically a highly choreographed emergency response plan. Now let's get into the active combat phase. Part 3, raids, seizures, and arrests. I really want to shine a spotlight on this specific, highly dramatic reporting requirement, metric HCBP 260A.3. You know, in the world of corporate sustainability reports, things can get pretty dry, for sure. But this metric? This turns raw corporate spreadsheet data into actual battle stats. This is where companies have to prove they are actively taking the fight to the counterfeiters. Now, pharmaceutical companies aren't out there kicking down doors and slapping cuffs on people, obviously. But they are required to report the number of instances where they provided the crucial evidence to legal and regulatory authorities. They tally up exactly how their corporate intelligence directly led to raids on counterfeiters, the physical seizure of the fake products, the actual arrests of the criminals, and the filing of criminal charges. It's a direct, hard measure of how effectively a company's internal security team is collaborating with global law enforcement. And they definitely don't do this in a vacuum. The standard notes that companies are constantly collaborating with other manufacturers, wholesalers, and even local pharmacies to build these massive cases. When they report under this metric, they have to describe the specific actions taken, who was involved, what was the company's exact role, what was the type and the financial value of the counterfeit products, and ultimately what was the final outcome. It gives investors a really clear picture of a company's real-world impact in cleaning up the streets, so to speak. All right, bringing us to our final section. Part 4. Auditing the supply chain. Under metric HCBP 430A-1, the standard demands a two-pronged approach to auditing. It is simply not enough for a pharmaceutical giant to just say, hey, our own internal factories are safe. Nope. They have to disclose their audit rates, comparing the entity's own facilities directly side by side with their Tier 1 suppliers' facilities. It completely forces a company to take full responsibility for the security practices of the external partners they choose to do business with. To be precise here, what exactly makes someone a Tier 1 supplier? Well, the standard defines them as suppliers that transact directly with the company. Now, to make this reporting feasible but still incredibly rigorous, companies are allowed to limit this disclosure to the core suppliers that, in aggregate, make up 90% or more of their total supplier spending. So we're really looking at the major players here, the critical chemical providers and logistics partners that actually keep the pharmaceutical giant running. And when it comes to measuring those audits, companies must report the exact percentage of both their own facilities and those Tier 1 suppliers participating in the RX360 International Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Consortium Audit Program. RX360 is this massive industry-wide initiative designed specifically to protect patient safety by strictly monitoring the integrity of the supply chain and raw materials. Seeing a really high percentage in this category tells an investor that the company is deeply, fundamentally integrated into global best practices for security. Now, the standards are realistic, of course. They clarify that companies aren't strictly forced to use a monopoly audit like RX360. They can use an equivalent third-party audit program. But, and this is a massive but, that alternative audit must be conducted by an external agency, and it absolutely must enforce the exact same rigorous integrity requirements for the supply chain and ingredients as RX360. There are zero shortcuts allowed here. The standard of proof remains incredibly high. So we've journeyed through the technological alarms, the dramatic criminal raids, and the intense factory audits that work around the clock to keep the global medicine supply safe. These standards ensure that companies can't just make vague, empty promises about safety. They have to prove it with hard, verifiable metrics. So I'll leave you with this thought to chew on. Next time you pop open a prescription bottle, ask yourself, what invisible numbers, global audits, and high-tech traceability worked together behind the scenes to guarantee that the pill in your hand is the real deal? Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and keep learning.